Hey, what's happening DC viewers? It's me, the DC Guy 1, and welcome to the video. This month marks the 40th anniversary of one of the most famous and influential comic book storylines of all time. The comic that helped usher in the darker and grittier nature of Batman that has defined the character ever since. The Dark Knight Returns. Originally released between February and June of 1986, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns is a 4-part series that follows an older Bruce Wayne as he comes out of a decade-long retirement and dons the cape and cowl once again as he returns to a world without heroes and a Gotham City that has fallen into chaos. Even if you've never read The Dark Knight Returns, you're probably familiar with the story and are more than likely to recognize many of the iconic images and ideas that it introduced, as almost every piece of Batman media released in the last 40 years contains some kind of nod to the story. Many Batman stories have either adapted or taken direct inspiration from The Dark Knight Returns, most notably The Dark Knight Rises and Batman vs. Superman. Beyond the major plot points, the influence of The Dark Knight Returns has expanded to every aspect of the Batman mythos since its release. Some of the elements that The Dark Knight Returns introduced that would appear in later iterations of the character include Batman's black and gray costume, which has since become his signature look, a more aggressive and violent Batman that is hunted by the police as opposed to working alongside them, the death of Jason Todd in the Robin Memorial in the Batcave, which would go on to become canon 2 years later in the Death in the Family comic, a dystopian future where many of DC's heroes have either retired or were forced into hiding and replaced, an elderly Batman who needs to rely on special armor as he battles a new generation of criminals, Batman having a contingency plan in case his identity is exposed that involves faking his death and destroying Wayne Manor, Bruce taking on a pupil to continue the Batman legacy, and many more. It's easy to forget just how many elements of Batman's story weren't really a thing until The Dark Knight Returns introduced them in the mid-80s, as it feels like they've always been a part of the character. In addition to introducing new elements, The Dark Knight Returns continue to build on one of the things that makes Batman as a character so interesting: his relationship with his rogues gallery. Batman has one of the best rogues galleries in comics, and a large part of that is due to how many of them are connected to Batman. An idea that has been getting explored more often in the last few decades is how Batman is at least partially to blame for many of his own villains, either because Batman played a role in their creation, or because his mere existence motivates them. This has raised the question around if Batman is as much to blame for Gotham's criminal activity as much as he's helping to fight against it. This idea was famously explored in Batman the Animated Series and the episode Trial, and has come up again in other stories where once Batman is no longer around, many of his villains disappear, as they feel there is no point to continue if Batman isn't there to challenge them. Or as Joker so eloquently put it,
"Without Batman, crime has no punchline."
This idea can be traced back to The Dark Knight Returns, where we see Joker, who has seemingly been in a trance-like state since Batman retired, immediately return to his old self and begin scheming as soon as he finds out Batman is active again, showing how Batman is a major factor in his villain's motivations. This idea of Batman contributing to his villain's actions is further explored in the final fight with the Joker, when Batman acknowledges the part he played in his villain's crimes and how his no-kill rule had enabled them to continue causing death and destruction for years, which Batman blames himself for, believing that he, in a way, has killed hundreds if not thousands of innocent people by letting criminals like Joker live. This is another idea that has become very prevalent recently, with some fans saying Batman's no-kill rule ironically results in more deaths, and debating over whether or not Batman should kill, or at least not go out of his way to save villains when they're a lost cause that aren't worth redeeming, or just can't be redeemed. While there's still a debate over if Batman actually fully goes through with it, depending on your interpretation of the final page, it's clear that he was willing to kill the Joker to stop him once and for all, marking a huge shift in the character's morals and for the first time since the original comics, showed a Batman that was willing to kill when necessary. A mindset that would have never been depicted even only a few years earlier, but now has since been teased and even depicted on several occasions over the last few decades. Speaking of redeemable villains, something that The Dark Knight Returns did a great job of highlighting is showing that many of Batman's villains aren't pure evil, but instead, like Batman, are tragic figures in their own right. This is mainly shown in Part 1 with Two-Face, who even after having his face fixed is so psychologically damaged that no matter what he looks like, believes there is no way for him to ever be truly fixed, and instead believes that his face has actually been fully disfigured, reflecting the monster inside, and that everyone is playing along that he looks normal. It's one of the more emotional moments of the story as you see two people who feel as if they can't change who they are, and have no choice but to be the person that the world has made them. It also serves as one of the first major instances in the comics where it's explicitly acknowledged that Batman is just as damaged and probably just as crazy as many of his villains, another idea that has since become ingrained into the character. We see this when we're shown that Batman is not a persona that Bruce Wayne puts on when fighting crime, but that Batman exists as a type of split personality that lives within Bruce as a separate entity, and if anything, Bruce Wayne is the persona that Batman puts on to hide what's inside. In addition to portraying a more psychologically damaged Batman, as mentioned before, this is a much more violent Batman than what had been seen up to this point. This isn't like the 60s Batman who knocks out bad guys in one punch or does just enough to incapacitate them so they're no longer a threat. This Batman brutally maims and cripples people with a ruthlessness that really drives home just how dangerous Batman is. And part of what made this so jarring is that he's not just doing this to supervillains or master criminals, he's doing this to your common street thugs and gang members. This is another aspect of the character that was introduced in The Dark Knight Returns that is now a key part of who Batman is, and many subsequent iterations have continued to push this idea and see how far they can take it. It's gotten to the point where it's now a running joke among fans that Batman has no problem mutilating criminals and beating them within an inch of their life, but if he takes a life, now all of a sudden he's no better than the criminals he fights. This has raised questions around if Batman has become too violent in recent years, and just how violent you can make Batman while still being true to the character. But this increased brutality didn't just come from nowhere, as it was necessary if Batman was going to be able to succeed in a Gotham City that had become more brutal and violent in itself. The world that The Dark Knight Returns takes place in is a very different Gotham City than the one seen in the Silver Age and the Bronze Age. There's no more death rays, elaborate schemes, or theatrical costume villains. These have been replaced by violent muggings, the murder of children, sexual assault, gang violence, and everyday people lashing out at the cost of innocent lives. The colorful criminals and hokey crimes were gone, and in their place were more simple, and as a result, uncomfortably realistic crimes that we are all too familiar with in our everyday world. This change marked another shift in the Batman mythos, and Batman's stories from then on became much more grounded in reality compared to other characters in the DC universe, something that many Batman adaptations have continued to integrate into their stories. Batman is now seen as one of the more realistic superheroes, and the world that he exists in has become increasingly darker, but not through shock value and excessive gore, but something more eerily subtle, by instead reflecting the harsh truths and uncomfortable realities of the world around us. A trend started in The Dark Knight Returns. And then, of course, the one thing that everyone remembers from the story, one of the most famous fights in comic book history, Batman vs. Superman. This was such a big deal when this happened, as it was one of the first times where the two biggest faces of their universe squared off, and is still the blueprint for fights between superheroes, with comics and movies constantly trying to recreate the magic of this moment. Even DC themselves love to keep coming back to this idea time and time again, while always trying to add something new to it to give it a unique spin, but have never quite been able to match the impact that it had in The Dark Knight Returns. While fights between two iconic characters was nothing new, going back to King Kong vs. Godzilla in the 60s and the Universal Monsters decades before that, this fight added something new that only worked because it was between Batman and Superman. Not only were they both heroes, but they were allies. These two had a decades-long history between them as friends and as partners before this, as opposed to other fights between superheroes where it's either the first ever meeting between them, or they never got along that well in the first place. Up to this point, despite their clear differences, Batman and Superman were always there for each other. And I think that's what made this fight so interesting, and something that other superhero fights, and even other versions of this story, fail to capture. There is something inherently intriguing when brothers fight, whether they be literal brothers or metaphorical brothers, which is why we see so many examples of this idea in every form of media throughout history. It's a classic tragic tale. Seeing two people who deeply care for one another and would even die for the other come to blows in what is understood to be a fight to the death instantly creates drama. And by having that established history between them and then seeing where they are now and that it's come to this, is almost more intriguing than the fight itself. I think that's what DC tends to get wrong whenever they try to do Batman vs. Superman now. It was so exciting back then because it was such a huge what-if scenario among fans that would seemingly never happen, until it did. Now, instead of a what-if, it's happened so many times that it's become a question of when, and has seemingly become an integral part of Batman and Superman's story that inevitably has to happen at some point. In The Dark Knight Returns, it was a last-case scenario, and even if it was always eventually going to come to this, they tried to avoid it at all costs until they couldn't any longer. Recently, it feels like Batman and Superman know that one day they're going to come to blows, and that they, or at least the writers, are just looking for a reason for them to fight each other. There's no more hype around it because we've seen it so many times. There's not as much drama because we've lost the notion that they never would, or that it would never happen. And I think that's why the fight between Batman and Superman in The Dark Knight Returns still holds a special place in history, because it did it at a time and in a way where it meant the most and had the most impact, and unfortunately, potentially prevented it from ever being done as well ever again. But that's part of the cost of being revolutionary. It's difficult to follow up. You set a new standard that everything that comes after now has to try and match up to. Even 40 years later, people are still talking about the impact that The Dark Knight Returns had on comics and pop culture, while other comic book storylines are forgotten after only a few years and leave little to no long-lasting impact. So many aspects of Batman's character that are now core elements of his story can be traced back to The Dark Knight Returns, and they have defined the Caped Crusader for the last 40 years. Even if you don't like the story, or you believe it's not even a good story, I think it's safe to say that The Dark Knight Returns is one of the most important stories in defining the character of Batman as we know him today. While there was definitely an effort to make Batman and comics in general darker and more mature before The Dark Knight Returns, it was still Batman in his bright blue and gray costume that he had had since the 40s surviving elaborate death traps. It wasn't until The Dark Knight Returns came out that the comic book industry found out just how mature they could take these stories about spandex-wearing superheroes, and in turn became the catalyst for a new era of Batman and the comic book industry as a whole. Within just 10 years of its release, we would then get Year 1, The Killing Joke, Death of the Family, Nightfall, and The Long Halloween. These are some of the most famous and important Batman stories of all time, and each one continued to build on ideas that The Dark Knight Returns had introduced. When you look at what came before The Dark Knight Returns and what came after, it becomes very clear just how significant of a turning point The Dark Knight Returns was, and how it arguably did more to reinvent who Batman was as a character than any other singular story had up to that point since Batman issue 1 in 1940. It managed to break away from the colorful campiness that had defined the industry for decades once and for all, and cemented Batman as the relentless vigilante that he's been ever since. But let me know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments below about what you think of The Dark Knight Returns, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos.